Welcome everyone to today's Explainer. We're going to take a really deep dive into one of the most complex, fiercely debated, and frankly, devastating conflicts of the entire 20th century. We're unpacking the geopolitical miscalculations, the grueling, on-the-ground guerrilla realities, and of course, the profound human cost of the Vietnam War.
Right, so let's tackle this massive historical question right out of the gate. It's a puzzle that completely reshaped modern warfare and global politics. Think about it. How on earth did a nation of farmers and localized guerrilla fighters manage to outlast and essentially outmaneuver the incredible, overwhelming conventional might of not just one, but two superpowers, the French Empire and the United States? To really grasp the why and the how here, we're going to follow a pretty straightforward roadmap. First, we'll look at a history of resistance. Then, the domino theory, the Jungle War, the turning point, the fall of Saigon, and finally, a devastating legacy. All right, let's jump right into part one, a history of resistance, and explore the deep roots of this conflict. Long before the U.S. ever even entered the picture, Vietnam's identity was essentially forged through centuries of repelling foreign invaders. Going as far back as 111 BCE, Vietnam fell under Chinese rule, which sparked a resistance that literally lasted a millennium. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the French arrived looking for colonial wealth. They set up French Indochina, brutally forcing local farmers into labor. Naturally, this deep-seated resentment birthed the Viet Minh in 1941, led by the nationalist and communist figure Ho Chi Minh. And by using brilliant guerrilla tactics crafted by General Von Nguyen Giap, the Vietnamese achieved the unthinkable in 1954. They surrounded and entirely defeated the heavily armed French forces at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Moving right along to Section 2, the domino theory. We are now stepping onto the Cold War chessboard. So, after the French packed up and left, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel into a communist north and a western-leaning south. Now, for the United States, this was suddenly no longer just a local Vietnamese issue about independence. Oh no, it had become the absolute front line of the global Cold War. And the U.S. was operating heavily on what was known as the domino theory. Just listen to President Eisenhower's words here. It perfectly captures that exact geopolitical paranoia that pulled America straight into the quagmire. He truly believed that if South Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would just topple like dominoes. And it was this exact philosophy that transitioned the U.S. from simply cutting checks and providing financial aid under Eisenhower to a massive, direct troop escalation later on under President Lyndon B. Johnson. By this point, the battle lines were crystal clear, drawn between two totally opposed regimes. Up in the north, you had Ho Chi Minh, heavily backed by China and the Soviet Union. Down in the south, you had Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the United States. But here's the tragic irony. Diem's government was incredibly harsh, corrupt, and oppressive. He ended up completely alienating his own people, especially Buddhists and rural farmers. So his oppressive tactics inadvertently pushed massive numbers of rural South Vietnamese citizens right into the waiting arms of the Viet Cong insurgency. Okay, Section 3, the Jungle War. This is a classic case of Goliaths versus guerrillas. When President Johnson drastically escalated things in 1965, he launched Operation Rolling Thunder, literally aiming to bomb the North into submission. The U.S. military leaned hard on its overwhelming conventional might. Massive aerial bombings, heavy artillery, and helicopters running constant search and destroy missions. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they were fighting a completely invisible psychological war of attrition. They relied on hit-and-run ambushes, incredibly deadly booby traps, and they blended seamlessly with the local population. They were farmers by day and fierce fighters by night. To actually survive those relentless American bombings, the Viet Cong literally went underground. We're talking hundreds of miles of incredibly complex, hand-dug tunnel networks. So to combat this unseen enemy, the U.S. deployed soldiers known as tunnel rats. These were insanely courageous, usually smaller-statured guys, given the absolutely terrifying job of infiltrating these hidden networks. Talk about a nightmare scenario, crawling through pitch-black, claustrophobic dirt tubes with nothing but a flashlight and a pistol, constantly evading booby traps, venomous scorpions, and of course, hidden enemy fighters waiting in the dark. That brings us to Section 4, the turning point. Let's talk about the psychological war. For years, U.S. military and political leaders had been confidently promising the public that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, early 1968 utterly shattered that illusion. During the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet, there was supposed to be a ceasefire. Instead, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive. It was a massive, brilliantly coordinated surprise attack hitting over 100 cities at the exact same time. They even managed to breach the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, strictly militarily speaking, Tet was actually a huge failure for the North. They lost tens of thousands of fighters and failed to hold any major cities. But psychologically, it was an absolute masterstroke. It proved to the entire world that nowhere in South Vietnam was truly safe. The sheer scale and shock of that offensive fundamentally shifted how the war was viewed back in the States. When CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who is basically widely considered the most trusted man in America, went on national television and told millions of viewers that the whole thing was destined to end in a stalemate, well, public support for the war just effectively collapsed. President Johnson's approval ratings plummeted so hard he actually refused to even run for re-election. And the illusion of progress just kept disintegrating, thanks to a massive tidal wave of domestic resistance. Remember, this was really the first televised war, and those brutal images totally contradicted the optimistic government narratives. We saw massive working-class draft resistance, fierce college protests, which tragically culminated in the shooting of unarmed students at Kent State. You had prominent figures like Muhammad Ali famously refusing the draft, and then Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, officially proving what many suspected. Successive administrations had been flat-out deceiving the American public for years, keeping things like massive, secret bombing campaigns in neighboring Laos and Cambodia completely off the books.
Now for Section 5, the fall of Saigon. We're looking at the withdrawal and the immediate aftermath. Faced with a totally unwinnable situation, newly elected President Richard Nixon rolled out a policy called Vietnamization. The idea was to shift the actual combat responsibilities over to South Vietnamese forces while slowly and steadily pulling American troops out. By early 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed promising peace with honor, and the U.S. officially withdrew its military. But for the Vietnamese people, the war was far from over. Without that massive American military backing, the ill-prepared South Vietnamese defenses just couldn't hold. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled right into the capital. The South surrendered unconditionally, and we saw the frantic, chaotic fall of Saigon, marking the definitive end of the Republic of South Vietnam.
Finally, Section 6, a devastating legacy. It's time to look at the true cost of this war. The eventual reunification of Vietnam did end the long war, but it left behind incredibly deep wounds that would take generations to even begin healing. The human toll was just staggering. Over 3 million Vietnamese lives were lost. It's one of those numbers that's almost incomprehensible to wrap your head around. And that represents not just vast numbers of soldiers, but tragically, millions of everyday civilians caught in the relentless crossfire, the bombings, and the ground combat.
For the United States, the loss was over 58,000 lives. And for the countless veterans who did actually make it home, they didn't return to a hero's welcome. They walked back into a deeply, deeply divided nation. So many of them struggled in silence with severe trauma, life-altering physical injuries, and a really profound lack of societal and governmental support.
And the legacy of this conflict, it rippled outward in so many different ways. Inside Vietnam, the new government set up harsh, forced re-education camps for anyone associated with the South. That sparked a massive humanitarian crisis, with over 1 million desperate refugees, often called boat people, fleeing the country by sea. The land itself was physically scarred, agriculture was devastated by unexploded ordnance scattered across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And over in America, the political landscape shifted permanently. It actually led Congress to pass the War Powers Act, strictly limiting how future presidents could commit American troops to foreign conflicts.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? As we look at modern conflicts unfolding around the globe today, we really have to ask ourselves what we truly learned from this incredibly costly war of attrition. The strict limits of conventional military power against a fiercely determined local insurgency were laid completely bare in the jungles of Indochina. And I'll leave you to ponder this. How do the ghosts of Vietnam and those tough lessons on asymmetric warfare still influence the world we live in right now? Thanks for joining me for today's Explainer.